Hello, everyone. Before the video starts, Ādi asked that I give a disclaimer at the beginning. In this video, we will be grappling with a piece of philosophy referred to as the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil deals with some very sensitive, complicated topics that extend outside of the realm of purely rational discourse. We're going to deal with some problems, some traumatic issues that you may or may not have experienced. And we're going to draw on historical examples that have had a devastating impact on the communities that they have affected. The disclaimer I want to issue is that we are approaching this from a purely philosophical standpoint. If you have recently experienced things like loss, if you are actively grieving, if you are having questions and asking yourself questions about the meaning of your life, we would both encourage you to seek professional help and not watch this video because some of the issues discussed might be a little triggering. Also, some of the historical examples that we draw upon, namely the Holocaust. When we talk about things like the Holocaust, we want to take this as seriously as possible. However, in this video, we're going to use the Holocaust as an example to illustrate a philosophical point. This is not to demean what happened during the Holocaust. This is merely to illustrate a logical problem that arises from events such as the Holocaust. All right, with that out of the way, I really hope that you enjoy my discussion. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I am here today with a very special guest, PhD candidate, Ādi Puruṣa Dāsa, who is currently studying at Cambridge University, specializing in the philosophy of religion. Are you doing a PhD in religion or philosophy? I don't know if I distinguish that.
The degree is theology and religion,
Theology.
but within that, my specialization is more philosophy of religion.
Gotcha. Ādi holds a master's degree in religious studies from Duke University, undergraduate degree in religious studies from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research interests include Hindu theology, philosophical theology, Vaishnavism. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Which I believe in the West we know as the Hare Krishna tradition. Is that correct?
Yeah, Vaishnavism is like a broad family of views, and the Hare Krishna tradition is maybe one of the traditions within that broader category.
Gotcha. And his PhD focus, as he already mentioned, is on the problem of evil, which is what I want to talk about today. So welcome, Ādi. I appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So let's start off big picture, kind of introductory stuff. Maybe you can introduce us to what the problem of evil is. Why is it a problem in the first place? Maybe some of the different categories, different types of problems of evil, if you want to start there.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, there's various formulations of the problem of evil, but the basic idea is that generally, as God is conceived, God is all good, all knowing, all powerful, and some other attributes in there, but those are typically the main three that get focused on. And the idea is that if God is all good, he would want to prevent evil or suffering. If God is all powerful, he would have the ability to prevent evil and suffering. If God is all knowing, he would know how to prevent evil and suffering. And yet there's suffering. So it seems that because there's large amounts of evil or suffering in the world, it challenges the idea of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient God. So one argument is just to show that there's like a logical contradiction, that the existence of God and the existence of evil, when you pair those together, it leads to some sort of logical contradiction. Logical argument was more popular. It's philosophers have mainly shifted their focus now to what's called the evidential argument from evil. It doesn't exactly try to show that there's a strict logical contradiction, but it does try to show that the existence of evil, and in particular particularly, we can say horrendous evils or sufferings that seem to really serve no beneficial purpose. The evidential argument from evil argues that the existence of these types of evils, makes it very improbable or unlikely that an all-knowing, all-good, all-loving God exists. And there's a few more different types of formulations of the problem of evil. There's Paul Draper, he's a prominent philosopher. He's advanced his own. He sort of argues that deism is, the evidence that we have favors deism more, that there's just like this indifferent deity. So we should prefer that. But that's maybe a little bit more of a complicated argument to address. So we can perhaps focus more on the evidential.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about this because the last time I really dug into the problem of evil was back when I was a lowly undergraduate student. And I won't tell you how long ago that was, but the logical problem of evil was like in vogue, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it fall out of favor? Is it just because the evidential argument became more popular in the literature and people started talking about it more? Like, why that kind of shift?
Yeah, so there's a Christian philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, and he authored a book, I think God, Freedom, and Evil, and he put forth what he called the free will defense. And he basically, many people basically agree that Plantinga's formulation and how he defended that view basically put the logical argument to rest. The specificities of that argument are a little bit tricky, but basically there's the idea that God can't create individuals with free will and at the same time control their action. So because individuals have free will and God can't really control what they do with that free will, it's not really within God's power to, make a world where there's just, a lack of suffering. Given free will, it's not really within God's power to, choose what individuals do and guide them so that they basically don't do any acts that lead to suffering. Plantinga's free will defense basically put that to rest. And then more attention was focused on the evidential problem of evil. During that time, there have been some people that have tried to sort of resurrect the logical problem of evil, and even recently, there's been some recent attempts to resurrect it. But I think, sort of the focus has largely shifted to evidential argument from evil.
And kind of, this is just a thought as I was watching some of your videos and refreshing myself on the literature. It kind of also seems that the logical problem of evil only holds if it was correct, like if this was a defeater of a theistic view, it only holds true if we take very particular views of God.
That's true. Yeah. There's some people that try to deny the argument by saying that, well, actually the conception of God we hold to just doesn't have these attributes. So I guess the problem of evil, it is helpful to clarify that it's directed towards sort of a very particular but also widespread conception of God. In my dissertation, I also argue that Vaishnavism actually holds to basically this notion of God, that God is all good, all powerful, all knowing. People usually don't tend to think that it's that Hindus believe in a perfect being or a God conceived that way, but there actually are quite a bit of Hindus, or at least the Hindu scriptural texts do talk about that notion of God.
Yeah, that's another thing I wanted to ask you about, because my knowledge of Hinduism is very general and very surface level, but I am required to teach it a lot of times in intro to religion / ancient history classes. But what struck me about your presentations specifically, I was like, wait a second, because when we think of God's attributes, all good, all powerful, all knowing, we typically associate those with the monotheistic traditions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Now, I do know that within Hinduism, there is this kind of this view of like Hindu theism, as it's sometimes called, and that certain Hindu traditions view God as one entity, but manifested / represented in different ways. But I've never heard, and again, this is because of my lack of knowledge, I've never heard those attributes attributed to the Hindu God. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So Hinduism, it's basically just like a broad umbrella term for a varieties of religious traditions that emerge within India. And it's sort of, they're distinct from, say, Jainism or Sikhism or Buddhism. Within that family of traditions, you'll have, quite a lot. There's Vaishnavism, which is family of traditions devoted to Vishnu or Krishna. You have Shaivism, family of traditions devoted to Shiva. Shaktiism, family of traditions that are devoted to sort of the goddess. You'll have people who are monists. You'll have all sorts of sort of views within Hinduism. Henotheism. I mean, nowadays Hinduism is just it can be a little confusing because like so many Hindus just have so many like wild and sort of divergent views. If you get 10 Hindus, you might just get 10 completely different types of views. So it's kind of a very it's very muddy to sort of try to find any commonality among these traditions, but you can maybe say that adherence to the Vedas, the Hindu scriptural text, is one common feature. Maybe some of them share other beliefs like reincarnation or the soul or karma, but you do find a lot of divergence actually. Within Hinduism, you can have two traditions that are more far apart than say Christianity and Islam, for example. So but basically within this sort of banner of traditions called Hinduism, you'll have Vaishnavism. And there hasn't been so much scholarship showing that Vishnu possesses these attributes. I've started to do a little bit of, I've published some research that sort of shows that actually in the text, in some places it's actually fairly explicit. There's one Hindu scriptural text called the Bhagavad Purana, and it says that God is sort of like the knower of everything. So that's quite close to omniscience, if not directly omniscience. You will find the views, maybe it hasn't been highlighted so much, but they're sort of there, and I think given some time, I think maybe there'll be more scholarship that will sort of explicitly mention this. But at least Vaishnavism, I would say, is a perfect being theology. It conceptualizes Vishnu or Krishna as being this omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving deity.
Yeah, and I want to clarify the reason to the viewers who may not be as familiar with this. The reason why I ask this is because if you accept that view of God, then the problem of evil becomes a problem for you, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of inviting it by taking that position, because some religious traditions might say we don't think of God that way, and in which case there's not really a problem, right? It's
basically directed towards a very specific formulation of God. I mean, maybe even if God is not all loving, maybe he's partially loving, maybe suffering is somewhat unexpected, but generally it's sort of the ones that put forth a really strong conception of God as the ones that have the most defending to do.
And I'm thinking here, there's a couple of Jewish scholars, specifically post-Holocaust. Elie Wiesel comes to mind when asked about the problem of evil, would deny God being all-powerful, right? Mm-hmm. Why did God let the Holocaust happen? That was a big question in Jewish literature. And Wiesel's answer partially was, well, maybe we have a misconception of who God is, or you know, the idea that God could have stopped this somehow is anyway. So yeah, I just wanted to, because it does seem like you're, not you specifically, but for people out there, your understanding of God either opens you up to this, or kind of you don't have to deal with this as much, right? Depending upon your conception of God, determines how much of a problem this is, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's, you kind of outline the problem of evil. If we accept that God is all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, then there seems to be a contradiction there, or an issue / problem there with the existence of evil. So let's get into maybe big picture, general categories of answers to that problem. And then I'll ask you to get into your specific response.
Yeah, so theologians and philosophers generally try to address the problem of evil by putting forth what's called a theodicy, basically an attempt to reconcile God's existence with evil. There have been some prominent theodicies. One is sort of a free will theodicy. So I alluded to this earlier, but the basic idea is that evil arises because of the way that individuals misuse their freedom, and God can't really control how we use our freedom. He can't give us freedom and yet control our actions. So suffering is sort of like a consequence of this. Evil is a consequence of this freedom. But still, a world where like individuals are free, even if it comes with suffering, is still better than a world where individuals don't have freedom. That's a prominent line of response, and I think most like theodicists would probably incorporate some element of that into their overall defense of their theodicy. Another common one is soul-making theodicy. So there's the idea that suffering builds character and sort of teaches us, beneficial lessons that allow us to come closer to God. And even like within some, in like the field of caring science, there's even like empirical research that sort of verifies this, that people do grow stronger through suffering. It forges character. And Viktor Frankl, he's written a book about this based on his experiences in the Holocaust. He's learned a lot through his suffering. Not that we condone the Holocaust, but
right.
But yeah, I mean, don't want to be very careful in dealing with that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence basically points to the fact that we learn lessons through suffering, and it might be painful when we're experiencing it, but sort of in the long run, it's it's more beneficial overall. Soul making, free will. What are some other? Those are sort of the main ones I draw upon. There's some other ones like evil sort of contrasts with the good. Because there's evil, we can appreciate the good more. There's some that say that, there's some that would say that evil is in one sense like an illusion. It doesn't really exist. There's some responses that might say, I'm trying to think of some others. I can't think of the sort of other ones. I'm really used to the free will and soul making being very common. Oh, there's some that say that like the regularity of the laws, it's good to have like a world with law-like regularities. So it's better to sort of uphold these regularities than to sort of intervene and prevent suffering. And different writers combine different responses together.
Okay. Now I will say that the free will and soul making do seem to be the most popular. Mainly because, well, I'll ask you why that is. You seem to endorse if I got this right, kind of a combination of the two. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. The theodicy that I developed centers largely on free will and karma. So free will is there, and it's beneficial for reasons mentioned earlier. But there's also karma, which is maybe the more unique feature of the theodicy that I defend. Generally, I mean, I haven't really seen it. Like most writers on the problem of evil, they may be coming from like a Christian background, and they usually don't affirm karma. But yeah, karma is fairly, like, at least within Hinduism, it's sort of the stock response to why they're suffering. Yeah, basically, for every action you do, there's a consequence depending on the severity of that action. So good actions are met with good rewards, bad actions are met with bad rewards, and the suffering that individuals experience is basically due to their past bad actions, either in this life or a previous one, which is usually why reincarnation is paired with, usually why karma is paired with reincarnation. And yeah, I also take that, I take the idea of karma and I show that, I highlight that it has a sort of reformative component to it. So karma is not meant just for the sake of punishment, but it's actually meant for teaching individuals these soul-making lessons. So that's where soul-making comes in through karma.
I want to come back to this, how you utilize karma in your argument. I want to ask you some more about this soul making, and I'll tell you a little bit experience that. So I was teaching a class over this past summer about arguments for and against the existence of God, and we covered the problem of evil. And again, my literature, my background on this is a little bit dated. So when I think soul making theodicy, I think John Hick, I think it was.
Yeah.
And John Hick, I still remember the article, even though I read it so many years ago, because of his use. He spent a lot of time trying to explain why it was that suffering could be beneficial. And I think he provided some good explanations for that. And I wanted to get your feedback. One of which was like kind of a basic example that sometimes suffering is necessary for a greater good. The primary example of that being like exercise. I don't know many people who like to run, but running is beneficial for our overall health, right? I went running last night with my wife. It was like 15 degrees outside. It sucked, right? But I do it for the overall health of my body. So the experience itself was a form of suffering, mild suffering, but it was good for overall health. And then he takes it to a degree with the experiments with the mice. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah, you can refresh my memory.
Basically that he referenced, and I don't remember what the experiment was, but this might sound kind of cruel, which gets into animal suffering, but we could talk about that later. But he referenced a psychology experience in which a group of mice were both run through a maze. One group, from the time that they were born, basically were not exposed to like harmful conditions, and the other group, from the time that they were born, were exposed to various like dangers in their cage. And what the experiment found was that once they were released into this maze that had all of these dangers, of course, the mice that had been exposed to dangers were able to better successfully navigate the maze than the mice that were not. They just like died immediately because they'd never been exposed to pain before, basically. And of course, he extrapolates this to the bigger argument that that suffering is good for our moral development as people. So would you tend to agree with that? Would you like to add some caveats or?
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I guess the what I sort of argue is that like when we experience pain and suffering, it makes us more sensitive to the pain and suffering of others because we can sort of we can reflect on our own pain and suffering, how that makes us feel, and that should cause us to be more sensitive to others and make us more reluctant to want to cause pain to others. So that's a big component of it, because ultimately to come closer to God, what's required is that we do develop a type of moral purity, and that moral purity requires, a care for others, and sensitivity to others, and one way of learning that is through sort of experiencing things for yourself and seeing how it affects your own self. Um, there's that. There's also the idea that there's another component of my theodicy that I maybe could have touched upon, but sometimes God puts individuals through difficult circumstances because in those difficult circumstances, it can cause us to deepen our devotion to God. Oftentimes when things are going well, you sort of forget about God, or you sort of, you don't feel such a strong reason to really call out for God. But when things are difficult, that's sort of when you really turn to God more intensely. So sometimes difficulties are there to provide an impetus for us to deepen our devotion. Another aspect of suffering is that when we suffer, we can also, now, like in Hindu worldviews, people tend to view them as a little bit more negative because, or maybe world denying, in the sense that this world is sort of viewed as a miserable place. Sort of the Gaudiya Vaishnava view would be that the world is sort of perfect in the sense that it's perfect for its purpose of allowing us to learn lessons, but our attachment to temporary things is what creates misery for us. So so one beneficial aspect of suffering is it can help us realize that our attachment to temporary things is not in our best interest, and it can sort of reorient us back to God and allow us to see that our highest happiness ultimately comes from a loving relationship with Him, rather than from staying in this world and trying to find pleasure through just like material things. So yeah, I would agree with Hick. I would maybe add some few other reasons why suffering is beneficial also.
So let's circle back to karma for a second, because everything that you just said, I don't think would be that problematic and seems to be in line with most Western religious traditions. Like I can't imagine a Christian or a Muslim objecting to that. But this idea of karma is kind of unique, right? So if you would elaborate on maybe first just briefly the kind of big picture view of karma, and then maybe tell me a little bit more about how it functions within this argument that you're making.
Yeah, so karma, it's maybe like a law of action and reaction. For every action you do, you get a consequence based on the sort of moral quality of that action. And if you do a really, really bad action, you'll get really, really bad consequence. If you do a really, really good action, you get a really, really good consequence. I also take the view that it depends also partly on your own moral knowledge. So if you have a awareness of good and bad, and you have like a lot of moral knowledge, and you do a bad action, you might get a more severe consequence because you're in one sense more culpable, whereas someone who doesn't really have that ability to discriminate, maybe like a child, you might get less severe reaction because he's maybe he's more innocent in one sense. And like I mentioned earlier, karma is usually also paired with reincarnation. So there's the idea that we suffer, or maybe we experience the consequences of our actions for things that we've done in this life, but we can also experience the consequences of actions for things we've done in previous lives, which is, that's one reason that people sometimes like to uphold karma because it allows you to make sense of like why good people, why bad things happen to good people, why good things happen to bad people. You can account for it through karma by appealing to previous lives. So yeah, that's karma in a nutshell. And where it functions in this argument is, so individuals, well, I take a view that's maybe not so common in Hindu thought, that something analogous to a fall. So there was, all individuals resided in sort of God's divine realm, and just a select, sometimes the number is like 10%, like 10% of them, through using their free will, decided to come here. And so once they're in this world, there's karma. And the reason there's karma is because it allows individuals to learn these, soul-making lessons and ultimately reorient themselves back to God. Now there is the point that when individuals do turn towards God and devote themselves to God, that God can actually destroy sort of the karmic merits and demerits that individuals have, and they're no longer under karma, but they're rather sort of under God's jurisdiction. That's another point I developed, but karma is mainly there for individuals that they haven't turned towards God, and God basically respects their free will by not intervening in their sort of karmic trajectories unless they really want his assistance. So that's sort of where karma is located within this framework. And basically the whole idea is that so that individuals can learn to turn back towards God. God creates this world as like a moral stage where individuals can learn lessons and learn that their highest happiness comes from developing a relationship with God. And sort of maybe you can say well, I would argue that it's the most efficient means to sort of structure this world is to make it so that it has these karmic laws. So basically, without sort of imposing any suffering on individuals, God can allow them to learn lessons, and the lessons are really targeted towards each individual's mentality. Yeah, that's sort of where karma fits into the whole big picture.
Okay. I do want to get into some of the common objections to the soul-making theodicy, but before I do that, I think it might be helpful to maybe give a little recap of your position thus far. Maybe you can phrase it as a response to if someone were to ask you, what is the purpose of suffering? Like, why do we suffer? Now, outside of like a personal context where a personal tragedy just happened, we'll keep it academic, right? What is the purpose of suffering?
Yeah, so the purpose of suffering is basically to reorient us to God in some capacity, whether by maybe it allows us to realize that this world is not where our highest happiness is, or whether it teaches us to be more empathic and more sensitive to others, or whether it provides an impetus for us to deepen our devotion to God, or maybe just teaches us some other type of moral lessons like the ones that John Hick talks about, or the ones that Viktor Frankl mentions that he learned. There's different ways that suffering can sort of achieve a beneficial purpose, but these are some of the ways.
Okay. So I think the two biggest objections here, at least from what I could find, first is the objection of horrendous evils. And then the second would be the objection of animal suffering. So let's start with horrendous evils. And I think we could talk about horrendous evils. And a horrendous evil is an evil that threatens to engulf any sort of positive meaning that an individual or a group or a nation can ascribe to life or their existence. Would you say that's a fair definition?
Yeah, there's a philosopher, Marilyn Adams, she gives like sort of a really technical definition of it, but I think you've more or less hit upon it. So it's something I would maybe rob an individual of meaning is maybe.
Rob an individual meaning. That's more succinct, yeah. So in that position you just gave us, how would you respond? Maybe to and maybe this dichotomy I'm is a false dichotomy, but I see it as like on an individual level, like a horrendous evil that might happen to me as a person, and then like big picture horrendous evils. We've already mentioned the Holocaust, so maybe we can stick with that. Like, how would your respond? How would your theodicy accommodate that or respond to that?
Yeah. So I guess I can start with the individual. So yeah, I guess the reason that there's really, really severe evil is you can say that I guess the idea is that sometimes that extreme amount of pain or suffering may be necessary to cause a certain behavioral change. And one thing that also has to be kept in mind is that this life is like a very sort of small part of our entire existence, spanning really basically infinite period of time. So maybe there's a horrendous evil that really devastates us, really sort of maybe even robs meaning of our life. But if that evil can change our behavior in such a way that in future lives we're somehow more inclined towards God, or we develop qualities that orient us towards God, in the long term, even a really horrendous act of evil can lead to a lot of long-term benefits if it can bring us closer to God by reforming our character in some way, let's say. So that's sort of why a really horrific act of evil might be there. I mean, maybe you can say, well, why not sort of space it out or break it out a little bit? So instead of like something that causes like 100 units of pain, it's sort of like 10 units of pain spread apart. Maybe one response is that maybe someone who experiences something horrible, really did do something quite horrific, so that you can't really break that up. Maybe there's one response that one big horrendous evil is sort of it sort of takes into account like several bad things that were done, and it sort of maybe combines them. Sometimes the details of exactly how things are administered are not quite laid out, but let's just say that someone who experiences a horrendous evil, they did something really, really bad in a past life. Yeah, the idea is that whatever caused them to do that action, there's some maybe moral, we can say defect, or there's something sort of off in their consciousness, and to rectify that sort of defect or issue in their consciousness, sometimes it really takes like a high dose to sort of get a message across. Of course, you have to be a little bit careful, because that can, that can sound very insensitive. So you have to, yeah, karma it's tricky because it maybe philosophically it resolves some issues, but as far as pastoral care goes, it's not always the best, approach. But extrapolating that to like large-scale horrific events, like say the Holocaust, or there's other ones like Asian tsunami and events like that. Yeah, there's several reasons, I guess. I don't want to just say all the Holocaust victims, it was their karma. Maybe there's some other reasons at play. Maybe God, I don't know. Maybe it was an impetus for some prisoners to deepen their devotion, or to really call out to God more intensely. And maybe for some of them, maybe they just had like a little bit to go before they fully surrendered, and that was sort of the last thing that got them to sort of really commit themselves more deeply. That is one available response. Another response is somehow a karmic consequence of things that the prisoners did in past lives. That gets kind of it can be a little insensitive, but at least karmic, through karma you can sort of understand that. But the idea is that the suffering somehow, the lessons it teaches can reform someone's behavior and leave a really strong sort of experience that affects how they act in future lives. It's maybe perhaps mentioning, especially if I'm about to address animal suffering, that there's this idea of an impression. In Sanskrit, it's called a samskara. And there's also the idea that there's a physical body that every individual has, and the physical body is temporary. And as an individual who's like a soul reincarnates, they constantly give up their physical body to acquire new physical bodies. There's also this idea of a subtle body. It's kind of like a mental body. It's composed of like mind, intelligence, and ego in Sanskrit. And this subtle body sort of envelops the soul, and as the soul transmigrates through different lives, this subtle body actually sort of stays with it. It doesn't actually abandon its subtle body. It sort of retains its connection with this subtle body, even though it abandons its physical bodies. And this subtle body is responsible for a lot of our character and mannerisms, and it it has a large impact on our psyche in a given life. So the idea is that these experiences of suffering also leave impressions on this subtle body and mold it in certain ways. So that's also why if you learn a lesson in this life, you sort of, because it leaves an impression on that subtle body, in future lives, that experience will still have its effect in some capacity, because that subtle body has been molded. So that's an important point to bring out when talking about these horrendous evils, because maybe within the effects of one life, the impact of these evils might not be apparent, but if you could sort of take a God's eye view of things and see how that individual is in future lives, you might be able to see that some horrific event in one life molded their subtle body, and in future lifetimes that molding really affected their behavior, and in a way that made them that brought them closer to God. So yeah, those would be some of the responses for these types of evils.
And it seems to me, and I don't want to put words into your mouth here, but it seems to me that your approach specifically offers a unique metaphysical framework to accommodate some of these questions that would not normally be available to a theist who did not accept karma and reincarnation. So what I'm thinking of here, and again, this conversation is not meant to, if you've experienced an evil of the kind that we're talking about, this is not psychology/therapy. We want to make that distinction, right?
Yeah.
This is where we're talking about these for the philosophical purposes. Not to say that the two always have to be separate. I mean, the problem of evil is a problem for this reason. Anyway, that disclaimer aside. So it seems to me that you're in a unique position to respond to this, because if you think of, Dostoevsky comes to mind in his, and I can't remember which work it was, but he's addressing the problem of evil, and he's responding specifically to child suffering, and he's saying, like, it's the brothers Karamazov, Ivan and Alyosha are talking back and forth to each other. Ivan being the atheist, Alyosha being the priest, and the priest says, well, everything happens for a reason. And Dostoevsky says, well, what about this child who just died? Like, what was the reason for that? For the Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that seems a bit more difficult to answer, because for you can say, and again, tell me if I'm misrepresenting here, but you could say that we have this metaphysical system of reincarnation that abides by the law of karma, and maybe we can appeal to what has happened in the past, or maybe even what will happen to that soul in the future.
Mm-hmm.
That does seem to do a little bit more logical work than saying they'll go to heaven afterwards type thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think it does make more sense out of instances like that. you can identify like a reason why that happened. Whereas if it's just one life, then you might not be able to find any like horrific act that is sort of proportional to that instance of suffering. So yeah, you can sort of look backwards and identify like a reason for that, and you can also look forward and show why that act can lead to greater good in the long term by looking at sort of how it influences someone's future behavior and future lives. Yeah, I think that's one of the strengths of the multi-life framework, where you have multiple lives in which you sort of live in this world. Yeah, there's maybe some unique objections that karma has, but I think in that regard, I think it does resolve a lot of these issues.
So let's get into animal suffering. Specifically, I'm thinking of, I think it's Mackey. Is it J.L. Mackey? I think presents the problem of animal suffering. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, Mackey. He has raised some problems with respect to the logical problem of evil. Who suffering?
Yeah. Who presents the doe in the forest example?
Oh, that's William Rowe.
William Rowe, yeah. So William Rowe presents the scenario with respect to the problem of evil, that you have I think he says like an innocent fawn, right? A newborn deer that's in the forest, a tree falls on the deer, traps it, and it's in immense physical pain for several days before it dies. This is also an objection to the problem of evil, because the question applies to animals is the same that it does to humans. Like, what purpose does that serve? Mm-hmm. So how would you in general respond to the problem of animal suffering there?
Yeah, so that's where this sort of metaphysical framework comes in a lot more. So the idea is that every individual is a soul, and keeps reincarnating, and it can reincarnate into animal bodies as well. So dogs, cows, elephants, they're all souls who, for one reason or other, are temporarily associated with an animal body. So that's an important point to sort of establish. And then also, as mentioned before, there's this concept of the subtle body, the idea that there's this sort of psychic or mental body that every soul is associated with, and this psychic body sort of affects the behavior of souls and can be molded by different impressions. So the idea is that animals, they also were in humans at one point. They accrued karmic merits and demerits, and when they're in animal bodies, then they're sort of exhausting those karmic demerits, we can say. So when they suffer, say, Rowe's fawn in the forest, you could say that suffering is due to its actions in some previous life, maybe when they were human. Generally, the idea is that you only really accrue karma as a human body, because only as a human do you really have the sort of moral knowledge needed to really be responsible for your actions. So yeah, in a past life, this doe or this fawn did something, and now it's reaping the result of that in this current body. Now, how this relates to soul making is that this experience of suffering would leave an impression on the sort of subtle body, even as the doe is embodied as a doe. Now, in that life, it might not really realize the effects of that, but maybe sometime down the road, it'll reincarnate into a human, and by that point, its subtle body will be molded in a different way. And as a human, it might be more sensitive to pain. It might sort of have a dispassionate attitude towards the world, might seek something more than just material enjoyment. In some way, that experience can benefit it when it basically transitions into a human form of life. And sort of an analogy that sort of illustrates this is like, even like within like a human life, when someone's young, they may get all these impressions that affect their psychology. And maybe at the moment, it doesn't really have a noticeable impact. But when they mature and get older, the sort of those impressions and the way it's molded someone's psychology really start to manifest more fully later in life. So you'd probably take a similar response there. Like as an animal, maybe you're sort of analogous to sort of like a baby, and you're getting these impressions. Then when you transition to another form of life, the impact from these impressions sort of becomes more manifest.
Gotcha. So it's a similar sort of response, maybe, to the response for the issue of horrendous evils. If we accept this framework of karma and reincarnation, that the pain experienced by that animal is for the larger beneficial purpose that may not be apparent in that particular lifetime, but would come about in later lifetimes. Is that?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Right.
You could argue that even horrendous evils might even have a benefit in this life. Now that I think about it, like there's people who go tremendous suffering, but sort of when all's said and done, they say, if I had to do things differently, I wouldn't change a thing. So you can sort of, even in this life, those those horrendous evils can sort of be overcome, but sort of the strength of the karma reincarnation response is that even if it's not overcome in one life, it could be overcome, throughout a series of lives.
Gotcha. Ādi, if someone is interested in pursuing this further, learning more about the problem of evil in general, and maybe about the soul-making theodicy in particular, what are some resources that you might recommend?
Soul making in maybe a generic sense, or like within a specific like Hindu context, or
both? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, John Hick's book, I think Evil and the God of Love. I can't remember the title, but I think it's something like that. That basically lays out soul making in sort of a broad sense, not quite with karma. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, it's maybe not philosophical, but he was like a Holocaust survivor, and he recounts his experiences and how he learned to cope with his suffering, how it was a source of meaning for his life. What's another good book? There's actually not so much done on karma, but I'm trying to think of some. There's a scholar, Gopal Gupta, we share the same last name. He has a recent book called Maya in the Bhagavad Purana, and he has a chapter on the problem of evil. There's let's see, soul making. There's a book by Trent. I don't know his last name. Dougherty, like Daugherty, or it's like Dougherty. It's like a book on animal pain. He tries to show how like Christians can respond to animal pain. It's interesting. It has the idea that animals have a soul. His response he takes is quite different than mine, but he does have a good segment on like how suffering can be beneficial for individuals. I'm trying to think what else. Richard Swinburne has also done quite a lot on this. I think he's got a whole book on the problem of evil. He's got a lot of these points. Peter van Inwagen has a book on the problem of evil. A lot of these are largely Christian responses. I think there's a book by Arthur Herman. Arthur Herman, he has a pretty extensive book on karma. I'm drawing a blank on the title of that, but the readers look up Arthur Herman and karma, they might be able to find it. That's also pretty extensive treatment of karma. I think, oh gosh, there's a few other books on karma, but I'm drawing the blanks on the authors and the titles. Well, hopefully my dissertation will be out soon, and I intend to turn that to a book. That'll sort of be one resource.
Well, once it's out, I will be more than happy to have this conversation again. Yeah.
Yeah. And even like there's Theology Unleashed. My friend Arjuni has a channel, Theology Unleashed. There's some debates I've done there. He might have some other debates that I haven't done, but he probably has very similar arguments he puts. That's one resource people can check out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I might think of more later, but that's what I have for now.
Right. I'll link those videos actually in the description of this video. Ādi, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join me. This was very, very interesting conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you.
Take care.